Hi there, today we're looking at overviews for Academic IELTS Writing Task 1, and we're going to look at how you need to approach them slightly differently depending on whether you're doing the paper-based IELTS test or the computer-based IELTS test. My name is Lara Ryan, I've been an IELTS examiner, I've been an IELTS teacher at the British Council, I've been teaching IELTS since 2010, and I am the founder of Complete Test Success. Before we jump in, make sure to click like and to subscribe to my channel. And also, if you haven't already seen my other lesson about overviews, you can find that in the link above. Now, a brief summary of that lesson about overviews is that we analyze graphs in two different ways. If there is one point in time shown in the graph, we will look for the highest and lowest values and then say what they are in our overview. But if there is more than one point in time in the graph, then we look for the increases and decreases and we say what they are in our overview. So if we take this graph as an example, you can see that we have the years 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020. So that is obviously more than one point in time. So we're going to see which categories increased and which categories decreased. Now, the problem for me, when I look at a graph like this, I find it a little bit difficult to organize the information. So to help me with this, I like to draw little arrows as to show me which categories increased, which ones decreased, perhaps some stayed the same. And then when I'm writing my overview, I can lump them together, I can group them together and talk about them all at the same time instead of talking about each category individually. So on this graph, I would look at the blue line and we can see when we compare 2000 with 2020, that is a decrease. So I draw an arrow down next to rugby, next to the blue line. Just so that I don't have to remember, I'll draw the arrow and that way I can see it clearly. Next, let's look at the red line, and overall that was an increase. Now, I know it went down in the first half and up in the second half, but we will talk about that later. Right now, I'm just looking at the general trend. Okay, and then the yellow one went down and the green one went up. So there are my four arrows to show me which went up, which went down. And then I can easily put red and green together because they both went up. I can easily put blue and yellow together because they both went down. Now, what I just showed you was where I was drawing on the actual question. And if you're doing the paper-based test, you can do this in the test. You just take your pen and you draw on the question sheet. However, if you're doing the computer-based test, this is not an option. So instead, you'll need to make some notes to help you organize the information. So in the computer-based test, on my note paper, what I would do is draw a little line here, and this would represent the blue line, rugby. Another one for red, football. Another one for yellow, which is tennis. And another one for swimming, which is green. So there I've represented the four categories by just drawing four lines like this. And then like before, I will draw arrows to represent which ones increased and which ones decreased. And of course, I will need to refer between the question on the screen and my notes. But this is enough information for me to organize it. And as you can see, it didn't really require a lot of effort for me to write this on the piece of paper. Now, of course, the reason I'm going to so much effort to make my overview appropriate is that we cannot get higher than a band 5 for task achievement if we don't have an appropriate overview. And even if your overview isn't perfect, you might limit yourself to a band 6 for task achievement. So getting this right is very important, and therefore it is definitely worth that extra little bit of effort of organizing the information before you write about it. So once I have all of the information clear in my head, the overview for this question would look something like this. Overall, football accounted for the most spent at the beginning and the end of the period and saw an overall increase. Swimming also rose over the period, whereas rugby and tennis both decreased. So you can see that I've said which ones increased and which ones decreased, and then I've just added an extra little bit of information about football being the highest at the start and at the end. Okay, for those of you who are new to my channel, I just want to let you know that I have free live feedback lessons on Zoom every week. So those are my free group classes for my email subscribers. If you'd like to get involved, you will find the link to join that in the video description. Now, that first question that we looked at was pretty straightforward, just 4 little lines, and that helped us to represent the categories. But it will not always be as easy as that, so let's have a look at some other ones. Okay, so in this graph, there is only one point in time represented. And what that means is that we are now looking for the highest and lowest values in each category. So what we would do in the paper-based test is we would look at rice production, and up at the very top, Hungary has the highest value. So I would just write a H there next to Hungary, and down at the very bottom, South Korea has 49. So that is obviously the lowest value. Then we would do the same thing for the red line, rice consumption. And once more, Hungary has the highest value and South Korea has the lowest value. So that shows us what we need to put in our overview. But once more, it's not as easy as that when we're doing the computer-based test because we cannot write on the question. So instead, on our notepaper, I would draw one square on the left to represent the blue category, rice production, and one square on the right to represent rice consumption, the red category. Now, for both of these, we need to find highest and lowest. So I would just add H and L next to each category, and then after that, I would go and look at the graph, and one at a time, I would add that information in there again. One thing to be careful with when you're doing this is that you don't represent the country or the category with a single letter, because there will be some circumstances where perhaps 2 countries started with the letter H, and if that happened, you can easily make a mistake later on. So use 2 or 3 letters to represent each one to make sure that you don't confuse them with a different category. Okay, and again, now I have the information organized, so I'm just going to take which ones were highest, which ones were lowest, and put that information into my overview. And then the overview would look something like this. Overall, Hungary had the highest values for both rice grown and eaten, while South Korea had the lowest values for each category. Okay, so with these next examples, I'd like you to pause the video and attempt them yourself before watching me. Okay, so with this one, the question is about preferences of seasons, and it is all based on one point in time. So once more, we're looking for highest and lowest values. So what I would do if I was in the paper-based test, I would start by checking which were the highest values for each age group. So we see the youngest age group, summer was highest, the middle one, summer again, and the oldest age group was once more summer. And then I'll go back through them and look for the lowest values. This time, autumn and winter appear to be equal for the under 15-year-olds. Then for the 15 to 64-year-olds, it is winter, and winter again for the oldest age group. But as you will see, the more categories that are involved, the more time is required for computer-based IELTS candidates to make notes and to organize the information. So let's look at how I would do this one. So here's my notepaper, and I would write down each category. Once more, we're looking for the highest and lowest values for each age group. So I would just make a note of that first, and then one at a time, I would see which one is highest for under 15s, which one is lowest for under 15s, highest for the middle, lowest for the middle, highest for the oldest, lowest for the oldest. So just go through them one at a time. Don't rush this process. I know it's a little bit frustrating because you have a limited amount of time, but it is so important that you get this right. If you get this wrong, it's going to be almost impossible to get a good score because you'll limit yourself to a band 5 for task achievement, which means your coherence and cohesion, your vocab and your grammar have a lot of work to do. So even though you might feel like you need to rush, do take your time with this and make sure that it is accurate. Okay, and just like before, now that I have my information organized, I'm going to write my overview and simply say which categories were highest and which were lowest for each of the age groups. So here is my sample. Overall, summer is the most, whereas winter is the least popular season for all three age groups. But autumn is equally unpopular with the youngest age group. Okay, so I do want to show you a sample of a pie chart and a sample of a table before we finish up. So let's take a look at these. So we'll start with the pie chart, and very simply, yet again, if you're doing the paper-based test, you're just going to write directly on the question. So we will mark all of the highest and we will mark all of the lowest categories for each country. But once more, it's not that straightforward if you're doing the computer-based test, because you need to make notes and represent this information. So, just like the last time, I'm going to put down one letter for each country: Z for Zambia, S for Singapore, and C for Cameroon. And we need the highest and lowest values for each one. So before I would even look at the percentages, I would have this written on my notepaper. Then I'll just go through each one at a time and write down the name of the category that is highest and lowest for each one. Then, as we saw before, we have all the information we need and we just transfer that information into our overview. So this time, the overview could look something like this. Overall, people from Singapore and Zambia are most concerned about overpopulation, while Cameroonian people are more concerned with waste disposal. In Zambia, pollution and waste disposal are equally causing the least concern, whereas the other countries see pollution as the least concerning. So those last three questions that we looked at were all based on 1 point in time, so we were looking for highest and lowest. So with this last question, let's look at a table that's based on more than 1 point in time, so yet again, we're looking for the increases and the decreases in each category. Okay, so here we have 2 points in time, 2010 and 2020. So for each one, I'll just see which increased and decreased. So for example, we see Vietnam for iPhone went from 3,500 up to 46,000. So that is an increase. And again, if I'm in the paper-based test, I will just draw this arrow directly onto the question. So then the next one, Bangladesh, another increase. Algeria increased, Iraq, Zambia, Bangladesh for Samsung, Vietnam, Iraq, all increased. And then the last two, we see the only decreases. So that's what I would do in the paper-based test. And this gets a little bit messy with the computer-based test because there are just so many categories. So simply what I'm going to do is have one column for iPhone, one for Samsung, write down the first letter of each country, making sure that no two countries start with the same letter. And then once more, just draw my arrows up and down next to each one. Now, I know I've said this already, but I can just imagine you in the IELTS test getting very nervous about the time limit because you're spending so much time making notes. But regardless of whether you have a lot of time or not, you have to do this correctly. So please, in the IELTS test, just give it as much time as you need to make sure that you don't end up with a low score. And this time, my overview would look like this. Overall, the sales of both devices increased in every country except in Zambia and Algeria for Samsung, where they decreased. Okay, so that's the end of today's lesson. Can you please leave a comment and let me know, would this advice have helped you in your previous IELTS test?